Today's lesson will be Chapter 23, Problem 3B. I'm sharing with you an Excel spreadsheet that I prepared for Problem 3B. What we're going to be doing today is variance analysis. And in previous videos, we've talked about the direct materials variances and the direct labor variances. But in this particular problem, we're going to also include with that your factory overhead cost variances. So that's the new part of this particular problem. We're going to be the Road Gripper Tire Company, and we're going to manufacture automobile tires. Standard cost and actual cost for direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead incurred for the manufacture of 4,160 tires were as follows. So you're going to be manufacturing 4,160 tires. Now, these tires have standard costs that the company has come up with, and then we have the actual cost that actually happened. And so our variances are going to compare our standard, our budgeted amounts with what actually happened to see if there was a variance and how much of variance it was, so that management can investigate why the variances happened. So they've given you the standard or the budgeted amounts for the materials. They were anticipating that 100,000 pounds of, I guess it's rubber since we're manufacturing tires, will be used or budgeted for the tire making process. And the materials, excuse me, budgeted amount is $6.40 per pound. That's the standard budgeted amount. And of course, we're going to compare that to what actually happened. This is the quantity of materials that you used, and this was the actual amount that the materials cost us. When we're calculating materials variances, we break them down into our direct materials price variance, which we're going to talk about first, and the direct materials price variance is calculated with this formula here. The second part of the materials variance will be the quantity variance, and the formula for the quantity variance will be here. And so all you do is you put in your actual price of your materials when you're calculating the direct materials price variance. We start with our actual price of materials that was given right here. So I just plug that in there. And I'm going to compare that to our budgeted price, which we call the standard price, at $6.40. This was the budgeted amount that went in here. Compare your actual to your budget. Notice my actual amount was more than my budgeted amount. So we had a 10-cent difference, and this is going to be an unfavorable variance. I can already tell that because my actual price was more than my standard price. So what you're going to do is find the difference between your actual price and your standard price, which is 10 cents. And then we're going to multiply that by the actual quantity of materials used. The actual quantity of materials used was 101,000. So this is where I'm getting the 101,000 that I put down there for the actual quantity. Multiply the actual quantity of materials used times the variance, which is 10 cents, and that gives you the direct materials price variance. The direct materials price variance for this problem is 10,100, and it is an unfavorable variance since the actual price was more than what we budgeted for. So you'd probably want to go back to the purchasing department to determine why there was a 10-cent variance there. And you would listen to what they told you, and then it's possible that you could determine if if there's anything you can do to improve this variance, and then you'll put it into action. So we use variances to help us to operate our company in the future better. The second direct materials variance is the quantity variance. And we're going to start by taking the actual quantity, which was given. The actual quantity of materials used was 101,000 pounds. We're going to compare that to the standard quantity, which was also given, which was 100,000 pounds. The difference between the actual quantity and the standard quantity is the variance. And since our actual quantity was more than our standard quantity, this will be an unfavorable variance. So we had 1,000 pounds was the difference or the variance in the quantity that we thought we were going to use and what we did actually use. 1,000 was the difference. We're going to multiply that by the standard price, and the standard price of $6.40 was given to you. So $6.40 times 1,000 is 6,400. Your direct materials quantity variance is unfavorable. And finally, we would add the direct materials price variance and the direct materials quantity variance together. And when these are combined, the total materials cost variance is 16,500, which is these two amounts combined. To find the direct labor rate variance, we would want to look for the actual rate, which was given. Let me see where that is. They got actual direct labor. The actual rate is $15.40. And so that's what we plug here. And we're going to compare that to the standard rate, which was $15.75. We'll plug it there. The difference between these is 35 cents. Notice that my budgeted amount was more than my actual amount. So this has to be a favorable variance. Notice also that favorable variances are marked by a minus sign in front of them. And so we would take this difference of 35 cents and we would multiply that by our actual hours. And the actual direct labor hours are given to you. The actual direct labor hours are 2,000 hours. So that's where I'm getting 2,000, and then you multiply, and your direct labor rate variance is a $700 favorable variance. To find your direct labor time variance, you would look at your actual hours, which was given, and you compare these to your standard hours, which also was given. So both of these amounts were given. And the difference between these is 80 hours. And because our actual hours are less than what our budgeted hours were, it's a favorable variance. And so that's why it's got a negative in front of it. And we're going to multiply that by the standard direct labor rate, which was $15.75, which was given to you. And so we'll multiply $15.75 times 80. Actual 80 is the difference in hours. So 1575 times 80 gives you 1,260. That is a favorable direct labor time variance. Remember, when it's favorable, we must put a minus sign in front of it. And because we've got a favorable direct labor rate variance and a favorable direct labor time variance, we're going to combine both of those favorable variances together to get our total direct labor variance. It's a combination of 700 and 1,260. Both of these combined are a negative amount, which means it's favorable, of 1960. Now, you probably would want to look at HR to determine why these are favorable variances, and that will help you to direct operations in the future as a manager. As a manager, you would also want to look at the time variance, and you will want to go to production to see why the time variance occurred, and if it was a good thing, we'd try to continue with what we had been doing to get a favorable variance. Now, also I showed you how to do supporting calculations for standard hours, which really wasn't necessary in this problem because they gave you the standard hours, but I want you to know how to calculate that. You need to know how to calculate that because a lot of times they won't give you the standard hours and you're going to have to figure out how to do them. So to find the standard hours, we would take the standard time to produce 1 unit, and we would multiply that by the actual units produced, and that will give us our standard hours. The standard time to produce 1 unit was given to you in this problem right here. It takes a half hour to produce 1 unit in our labor department. And so a half an hour times the actual units produced, which was 4160, that was given in our instructions. Remember, we said there were 4,160 tires produced. And so if you multiplied a half an hour times 4,160 tires produced, it would give you the total standard hours. So if they hadn't given you that, this is how you could find it. So both of these variances for materials and labor, we've already gone through. So you should be getting familiar with how to calculate those variances. The new variance that I want to emphasize today is your factory overhead variance. And your factory overhead cost variance consists of your variable factory overhead controllable variance and your fixed factory overhead volume variance. So we break them down into 2 separate variances, the factory overhead. The variable factory overhead controllable variance, as its name implies, is something that management could possibly control in the future. The fixed factory overhead volume variance, they have some control over it, but not 100% control over this one. But we're going to look at the 2 separately first, and then we're going to combine them together to get the total factory overhead cost. So let's start with the variable factory overhead controllable variance. Your actual variable factory overhead is $8,200. And let's see up the top here, that should be given to you. The actual variable factory overhead was $8,200. It's given right there. So we're going to start with our actual variable factory overhead that was given. We're going to subtract out our budgeted variable factory overhead. Notice it says to see the calculations below. So to get the budgeted variable factory overhead, we're going to use these calculations right here. We're going to take the standard hours for actual units produced, and that was 2,080. You'll remember we found that here, but they also gave us this amount. So you don't really have to calculate it. This is a given amount for your standard hours. You would have to multiply that by the variable factory overhead rate. And the variable factory overhead rate is given in this problem as $4. That's your variable factory overhead rate. And there is a way to calculate that variable factory overhead rate. And the way that you would do that is you would take the total amount of the budgeted variable factory overhead and divide it by its normal productive capacity. And so we could determine that amount. And if you look at your textbook on page 1137, it tells you how to do that. Now in this problem, we didn't have to calculate that variable rate, but it's a good idea for you to learn how to calculate the variable factory overhead rate as well as the fixed factory overhead rate. So I'm asking you to refer back to page 1137 because I think it's very important that you know how to calculate those rates so that you can understand how the formula works in calculating your variable factory overhead controllable variance and also in calculating your fixed factory overhead variance. So make sure you go back and review that page in the textbook so that you'll know how to get these variable factory overhead rates. But in this case, it was given. So we simply multiply the variable factory overhead rate by the standard hours for actual units produced, which was given, and that will give you the budgeted variable factory overhead. Once you have the budgeted variable factory overhead, you're going to compare this to what actually happened. And so what actually happened was 8,200. That was given at the top of the page. And we compare it to the budgeted amount, this budgeted amount we just found right here, compare the two of these. And because the actual variable factory overhead was less than what we budgeted for, it is going to be a favorable variance. So our variable factory overhead controllable variance is favorable. And so management would want to know why that was favorable and to see if they could continue to do things properly in the company so that it'll help them to operate better in the future is by knowing what these variances are from. It will help us to make good decisions about how to operate in the future as management. So this is how you get the variable factory overhead controllable variance. The next variance that we need to talk about is our fixed factory overhead variance. And our fixed factory overhead volume variance is found by taking our standard hours at 100% of normal capacity. This is a given amount up above in cell address B12. So if we go back up here and we look at B12, right here is the given amount of the capacity at normal capacity. This is 100% of normal capacity. It's going to take them 2,000 direct labor hours. This, I want to emphasize that this is 100% of capacity. Now, unfortunately, in this problem, you can see there's 2,000 hours here, but the amount comes from this right here. It just happens to be equal to this. These don't always have to be equal. The 100% of normal capacity is 2,000 direct labor hours, and that's what they're using to determine this standard hours at 100% normal capacity. It's 2,000 hours. Then you're going to subtract out your standard hours for actual units produced. Well, you could calculate that. We did that here, or it's also a given amount. And that given amount was right here. So either way, you need to know how to get your standard hours for actual units produced. A lot of times the problems won't give you this amount. They just happen to in this particular problem. So it is important that you know how to calculate this amount. So refer back to the calculations for standard hours to get that amount there. The difference between these is the variance in hours, and this is called a volume variance. And because our standard hours were less than what we actually produced, it's going to be a favorable amount that we're considering here. And then we're going to multiply that by the fixed factory overhead rate, which in this problem was given to you. The fixed factory overhead rate was $6. It was given right here. And so we're going to multiply the 80 hours difference times $6, the fixed factory overhead rate. And that will give you a $480 favorable fixed factory overhead volume variance. Then once we have this, we combine the fixed factory overhead volume variance with the variable overhead controllable variance. These two combined are the total factory overhead cost variance, which is favorable because both of these amounts are favorable. You just combine them together to get 600 as the favorable volume variance. All right. Something that I want you to notice is that your 100% capacity was 2,000 hours, and that was given, or you can figure it. But the standard hours for actual units produced were 2,080. So that's more hours than what you had anticipated. And that means that you went over 100% capacity. And that's why this amount is favorable. It's not always a good idea to have a favorable fixed factory overhead volume variance, because it may mean that if we're operating above 100% capacity, that we have too many units on hand that we won't be able to sell those. So you have to be careful about this favorable variance here when you're analyzing it. And again, it's a really good idea for you to refer back to pages 1137 all the way over. I would make sure I read all of this carefully to page 1140. I would make sure that I understood what was going on those particular pages. So the variable factory overhead and the fixed factory overhead volume variances were what was new to this problem. And so I want you to make sure that you know how to calculate the variances for materials, labor, and factory overhead. So this problem would be a very good problem to study by. That's all I want to talk to you about today. So I'm going to stop sharing this with you, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.